So in today's lesson, we are going to begin chapter 2, probability. And so this unit on probability will focus on learning about the likelihood of certain events taking place. And of course, that, as this diagram sort of shows, can be on a scale of completely impossible to certain and anything else in between. So I think that most of you will bring with you some life experience that will help you to navigate this course or this unit. And so let's take a look at the prerequisite skills. As with every unit, we want to make sure that you have some ideas reviewed before we begin. And so the prerequisite skills for this chapter involve primarily us taking a look at fractions, decimals, and percents. So one of the skills that you're going to need to have is the ability to convert a fraction into a decimal. And so one way that I like to think about fractions is sort of the idea that when I say 3 out of 5, that really means 3 divided by 5, right? And so, I'm going to write that out, I think, just so that we have that there. So 3 out of 5 really means 3 divided by 5. Right? And so to express our fraction as a decimal, that's all we really need to do is take that 3 and then divide it by 5. And what we should get is 0.6. And so, and that's all there really is to it. So again, it's just remembering that when we write a value as a fraction, then that implies division. So in the same way for this second example, to convert 13 out of 30, which is a fraction, into a decimal, I'm simply going to say, well, 13 divided by 30. And then I'm going to write out what that response is. So 13 divided by 30 gives me 0.43, and the 3 is repeated, so 0.43. And I'm going to write a little bar over the 3 to say that that number is going to be repeated. Now, some of you might be saying, well, how do I round? How do I know how to round? So if a question doesn't specify, then you're sort of open to interpreting that in whatever way that you want. Typically, I will probably specify for you. Okay, so now that we've reviewed that skill, take a look in your textbook on page 58, number 2, and I want to remind you that I have an online textbook available on my website. Navigated to my website. Here are our courses. There is MBF 3C. And then here we have our online textbook and the links to the online textbook. So you should be able to easily find the questions that I'm asking you to complete. So for example, here is question number 2 on your prerequisite skills. Another task that you might be asked to do is to express a decimal as a fraction in lowest terms. So so in this case I have 0.40, and in this next case I have 0.18. And so I want to just quickly sort of on the side have a discussion about place value before we get into this. Okay, so let's just quickly have a chat about place value. So if I have 0.1, that is equal to 1 out of 10, right? So, and if you want to check this, what you can do is you can simply, go in reverse, do what we just did and take this value and say, well, what is 1 divided by 10? That's actually equal to 0.1. So that's how I know that. And so following this trend, I know that 0.01 is equal to 1 out of 100, right? And so again, following the kind of working backwards from what we did in the previous example, if I were to take 1 and divide it by 100, that would give me 0.01. And I can kind of go on and on with this trend. So 0.001. I know is 1 out of 1,000, right? And so that's, again, coming from that division. 1 divided by 1,000 will give me 0.001. And so another way to think about this is to look at the number of zeros or the number of decimal places, right? And so I see I have 1 decimal place here, so that means I have it out of 10. If I see 2 decimal places, then I know that that's out of 100. And so I think of the number of decimal places as the number of zeros that I see here. And so here I have 1, 2, 3 decimal places, which means I'm going to have 3 zeros in that denominator, right? So that is one way of thinking about it. Now I think we're ready to take a look at the example. So when I look at this example where it's asking me to convert my 0.40 into a fraction, I'm looking at the fact that it has 2 decimal places. And the fact that it's out of 2 decimal places means that I want to create a fraction that is out of 100. Okay, remember the 2 zeros, the 2 decimal places mean I've got 2 zeros in my denominator. And then I simply take the value of the numbers after the decimal. So that means 40 out of 100, right? 0.40 equals 40 out of 100. And again, if I wanted to, I could do the division here and kind of go backwards and discover that. But now I have a fraction that I need to make sure is reduced to lowest terms. And so I'm going to look at this and say, well, what is, the highest number that both of these can be divided by? And then I kind of go from that. Now, a couple things that I notice here. I noticed that both 40 and 100 are even numbers. And so I can always start with seeing if both the numerator and the denominator are divisible by 2, and then maybe by 4, and then go up from there to see what the largest number is that I can divide by. And so I know, because I've done this a bit, that both the numerator and the denominator are divisible by 20. And in case you didn't get that the highest number would be 20, I'm going to give you a different strategy in a minute that you can try out. So if I divide my numerator and my denominator by 20, 40 divided by 20 will give me 2. And then 100 divided by 20 will give me 5. And now I have a fraction in lowest terms. So some of you may struggle to find out what the greatest number that both the numerator and the denominator can be divided by. And so I'm going to, give you a different kind of trick. So let me erase some of this. Oopsies. Let me erase some of this. And I would say start low and then go higher. So if you want to start out low and do this stepwise, that's perfectly reasonable. So you may have said, well, I know that both can be divided by 2. And so I'm going to try that. And so 40 divided by 2 is 20, and 100 divided by 2 is 50. And so you might have seen at that first stage that you could keep going and that you can continue to reduce. And so at this point, you may, if this is what you tried, you might have said, well, both my 20 and my 50 are divisible by 10. So, because that's obvious, they're both, multiples of 10. If you give that a try, then you'll still get to that same 2 out of 5 or 2/5 as your answer. And so, multiple different ways to reduce to lowest terms. You can do it in one step, or you can do that in multiple steps. Oops, this should be a 10. All right, so let's take a look at the next example, and I'm going to encourage you to pause the video and then try this one on your own to see how you do. All right, so I'm going to take this up. So again, I see that I have 0.18, which means that I'm going to write this as a fraction out of 100 again, okay? Because there's 2 zeros in 100 and 2 decimal places in my decimal. And so that means I have 18 out of 100. Now I'm ready to reduce this to lowest terms. So I can see that both my numerator and my denominator are even numbers, which means they're divisible by 2. So I'm going to give that a go and see where I get. Okay, so I'm getting 9 out of 50. And I've racked my brain, and there are no other numbers that can be divided into the 9 and 50. So I'm actually, at this point, I am all done. To try another couple of examples with you just to see what it would look like if we had more than 2 decimal places. What would that look like? So I'm going to give you a couple more examples, and I'd like you to try them on your own and see how you do, and then we will take them up together. So the first one would be 0.245. I'd like you to convert that to a fraction, and then we'll give this next one a try, 0.8. So pause the video, give those a try, and then come back when you are ready. So I'm going to divide my page up to cover these 2 examples. So I know, first of all, that when I write out 0.245, I see that there are 3 decimal places, which means that that's going to create a fraction where there are 3 zeros. So 1, 0, 0, 0. So this is going to be out of 1,000. So I have 245 out of 1,000. Now I'm noticing that both my numerator and my denominator end in a multiple of 5. So I'm going to try dividing both of these by 5 just to see if that reduces it completely. And it may not reduce it completely, but I'm going to see where I get and then maybe reduce further if it's necessary. So 245 divided by 5 gives me 49. And then 1,000 divided by 5 gives me 200. And so I'm thinking about the numbers, the factors of 49, right? I've got 1 times 49, right? And then I have 7 times 7 gives me 49. And so I know that neither 49 nor 200, I know 200 is not divisible by 7 or by 49, and so I am done. So let's take a look at the next example. So I can see here that I have a value with 1 decimal place, which means that the fraction that I create is going to be have 1 0 as well, so out of 10. So that means that I have 8 out of 10. Now, taking a look at that, I know that both 8 and 10 are divisible by 2. So I'm going to start there and see where I get. And I know that they're divisible by 2 because they're both even numbers. So that's going to give me 4 out of 5. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. And I can't reduce that anymore, so I am done. Okay, hopefully you found that to be okay. I'm going to just scoot back to the last slide and point out the following questions for you to try from your textbook. Give that a go and before resuming this video and carrying on. So the next skill that we need to practice before we move on to our unit content is to know how to take a percent and convert it into a decimal and a fraction, okay? Because often probability is expressed as a percent, right? So or the odds? Well, the odds are 50%, for example. You can convert to a decimal and then as to a fraction, or you can convert your percent to a fraction and then into a decimal. It doesn't really matter. And so I'm going to show you both approaches through these next 2 examples. So, one way to think about percents is to remember that percent means out of 100, right? And so 60% means 60 out of 100. And so I can go ahead and now reduce that to lowest terms and dividing by, I'm going to start with dividing by a power of 10 because they're both powers of 10. And then I'm going to see where I get. And that might not be the quickest route to the answer. I know what the quickest route is, but this may be your strategy. And so I know that that's going to give me 6 out of 10, right? And so now I know that both of the numbers that I have here are not in their lowest terms because they're even. So I'm going to divide by 2. And that's going to give me my fraction in lowest terms, which is 3 out of 5. Now, if you had by chance realized that, both of the numbers that we have here are actually divisible by 20, then you could have gone straight from 60 out of 100 to the lowest form by dividing by 20. And that would have given you the 3/5 right off the bat. So that would be a quicker way to do that. But more than one way to do this. Okay, so now that we have this in fraction form, we remember that 3/5 really just means 3 divided by 5. And so if I divide 3 by 5, I'm going to get 0.6. Right? So at the end of the day, what is my value of 60% as a fraction? Well, it's 3 out of 5 in lowest terms. And what is my value of 60% as a decimal? Well, it's 0.6. Okay, so that's one approach that we can take to getting fractions and decimals from percents. But I want to show you an alternate way to do this. And so I'm going to show you with my second example, how to do this, maybe starting from a different starting point. And you can choose whichever strategy you find the easiest. Okay. So in grade school, often they will tell you that you can convert a percent to a decimal by simply taking the decimal point at the end and moving it back 2 spots. And that will automatically convert from a percent to a decimal. So here I am at 0.35, moving my decimal back would give me 0.35. And there it is in decimal place, right? So in the last question, what we saw was that the number of decimal places equates to the number of zeros in the power of 10 when we write this in fraction form. So I can write this as a fraction out of, well, 2 zeros means I have 100. And that gives me 35 out of 100. And that makes sense, right? 35% again means 35 out of 100. And now all I need to do is reduce my fraction to lowest terms. And I can see that both my numerator and my denominator are divisible by 5. They're multiples of 5, so they have to be divisible by 5. And so now I'm just going to reduce that and see where I get. So 35 divided by 5 gives me 7, and 100 divided by 5 gives me 20, so 7 out of 20. Now, since 27 is a prime number, I can pretty much be confident that I am done at this point. So again, I can start with percents and to fractions and then decimals, or I can start with decimals and then fractions. Whichever way works for you. Take a minute to try out page 58, number 4. And once you complete that is your work for today. And hopefully we will see you tomorrow.